this another episode of Frame and Reference. I'm your host, Kenny McMillan, and today we're talking with Kuras, ASC, the DP of the new series Pretend It's a City, which focuses on Fran Lebowitz, essentially through the eyes of Martin Scorsese, because the whole series is basically Fran talking with Marty cackling in the background, but it's a lot of fun. Ellen is insanely talented, amazing career. She shot Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Blow, Bamboozled. I mean, there's just go check out her IMDb, you'll see. She's also directed a few episodes of The Umbrella Academy, which is one of my favorite shows of recent release, Ozark, et cetera, et cetera. So just, I was very privileged to have this conversation with Ellen, so I'm going to let you listen to it now. So I'm going to shut up, and here's my conversation with Ellen Kuras, ASC. The way that I like to start every podcast is, because we all come from different places, is just what got you into cinematography? Were you always a visual person, or did you come from like a photography background, or did you kind of happen into it?
I kind of came to it as a director, as a filmmaker, because I watched movies for a long time. When I was a kid, we had one movie theater in our town that played the same movie for 6 weeks. So, I had to go see it numerous times. And I remember seeing 2001 for the first time and just being completely blown away. And then, kind of on the anthropological side, I saw a movie called Billy Jack, and that kind of opened my eyes to, showing that you could, base a story on a real life situation and change people's perspective about it. And then, so I kind of left cinema and movies behind because I went into a more academic field. I was into history and language and that kind of thing. And it wasn't until I was in college that my second year, I ended up taking a class in photography at the Rhode Island School of Design because I went to Brown. And the moment I heard that I could take, classes at RISD, I was like, I'm there, because I had always wanted to go to art school. My parents would never let me go to art school. So I took this photography class and it changed my life. The first time I looked through the viewfinder, I thought, oh my God, the different world. It was the first time I really looked at light in a different way. I looked at depth in a different way and was starting to learn how depth of field works and how you can really, choose your point of view. And so, the camera always stayed with me and I would take pictures, but I was always somebody who thought more globally about, meaning. And so, I ended up getting more interested in film at that point and decided I would, mix film and photography. And then when I got out of college, I took some classes at NYU at night for a thesis project, and I had to, for a master's, and I had to think of a thesis project. So that's where I was like, all right, I'm going to make a film. And so in making that film, I, was thinking of it as a director. I was thinking of the shots I wanted to do, the voiceover or the kind of things I wanted to interview. And I was interested in doing a film that was kind of the intersection of fiction and documentary, which nobody was doing at the time. I mean, we're talking about, the early mid 80s, and, MTV was just starting at that time. But people weren't thinking about that. It was either docudrama or it wasn't. And so I started making this film and I hired a cinematographer, on the little money I had from a grant. And I didn't really know him. He was recommended to me, really great guy, did commercials. And, I tried to explain to him what I was looking for with the images, and how I wanted to put together in relationship the people that we were going to be shooting. And we were shooting in film, 16 millimeter. And when I got the dailies back, I was looking at the dailies and I was like, they're really nicely shot. The light was nice, nicely done. And, he positioned himself in the right spot. And I was there with him, but there was something that was missing and I couldn't put my finger on it. I was like, it's just not doing something for me. So that's when I decided to pick up the camera myself, and having had the camera in my hands already, I already knew that, you can put into relationships uh, people and objects and space, and it has meaning to it. And I thought that's what I want to explore. So it started this exploration for me of picking up the camera and trying to find meaning. How do I create meaning with the lens? How do I create meaning with movement? And that began an inquiry, which is still going on today. It's kind of an exploration of meaning through cinematography and now through directing. And so I've gone back to directing. I've almost come full circle. And I just came from a meeting I'm working with Darren Liu on a project, and he's this great DP, and it's so much fun for both of us. And you hear the sounds of New York City beyond. Um, it's so much fun for Darren and I to actually get together and speak the same language. And he was so excited. He says, we can shortcut, we can shorthand. It's like, you know what I'm talking about. I know what you're talking about. So there's a certain kind of language that speaking about visual language. So, it's almost like, we understand what the idea of metaphor is and how we're trying to get to a certain idea visually. So, for me, I couldn't be more thankful for having had a real journey in cinematography, because now I feel like I know what that is, and it's still for me something I'm learning about every day and trying different things.
Yeah, it's like medical practice. You never. It's a practice. It's not a thing. When
Right.
I think now more than ever, probably, I don't know if you would agree, but like now more than ever, I feel like DPs have to have sort of that multidisciplinary approach. You can't just, because everyone, quote unquote, everyone kind of knows the DP's job now because cinematography has become much more accessible. It feels like the most successful DPs are also directors, are also big one for me is editing, knowing, like, being really good at edit. Oh, I don't want to toot my own horn there, but like being proficient at editing made me a much better cinematographer because I knew what shots especially for like the AD or whatever, I knew what shots we could get rid of. Because I'm like, honestly, we're not going to use that. I can guarantee you we're not going to use that angle. Let's just do this other one.
Well, that makes a big difference because I, as always, as a cinematographer, and this is something that I developed over time, but always was thinking about how is this going to cut together? Because even from the very first days, if you start shooting all wide shots because they're cool, they're never going to get cut together unless that's part of the stylistic approach of the piece, but you have to decide that in advance. So always in my mind's eye, I'm thinking about what is the editor going to need to tell this story? What are not only the angles, but, should I zoom in and get a close up of this, or should I do that? So I'm constantly having a conversation with myself in my head about, what it is, how this thing is going to be edited together. And so, as editing could take different forms. It could be, really long, languorous shots. Like the director could say, I want to do like 5 minutes of voiceover over 2 shots. So those are the kind of things that you take into consideration when you're approaching, the blocking and the camera and what the camera's going to do. And so, yeah, editing is kind of key to know. You have to think about it editing it in your head as you go along. And that enables you to ask questions of the director and say, so, do you think that you're going to see this? Do you think you might want this? Because they're not always thinking about that. So, a lot of times the directors are so into what's happening in the action and they're looking around them. So they're not thinking of those things. And that's part of your job. And part of your job is to, get into the mind's eye of the director and understand the story that the director wants to tell, and try to augment that vision and try to realize that vision. But also on your part is, what's the story you want to tell with the camera and with light and all of that kind of stuff, so there's lots of different elements that go into it. And so I think that, nowadays being a cinematographer it's a lot to think about because the technology changes so fast, and you have to understand the difference between the digital and what is going to happen in post and all of this kind of stuff. So because there's many more options than there ever were, um, but the fundamentals are still the same.
Yeah.
So when you think about it, it just boils down to the same kind of things. And that's the landscape of cinematography has changed so much because many more people have access to cameras. I mean, when I was starting, I had to rent a camera. It was a film camera. I couldn't afford a film camera at the time. So I had to rent one. So I couldn't go out that much. So to practice with it was a real challenge, which is why everybody did Super 8.
Right.
You had to wait for the film to be developed, but now anybody can pick up the camera, they can use their phone or whatever. But therein lies the difference. So, what's the difference is the point of view is the difference and how people shoot it. Like anybody can shoot, but not everybody can shoot.
The thing that's been interesting is, everyone's saying anyone can pick up a camera, but not everyone speaks the language. And it feels like the language of cinema is sort of being diluted by popular content, I guess is the cheapest way to put it. Where did you learn that language, or how did you learn that language? How did you figure out how to put meaning into a shot, or what the difference was between them?
Oh, it's a really good question. I mean, part of it is intuitive, but part of it is also um, knowing what happens if a person, comes to the window and they say their line and then they turn and they look out the window. There's a certain meaning to it. And it has to do with a lot of our cultural collective that we experience or we gather over the course of our lifetimes, of thinking about, what does a look mean? What does a turn of a head mean, or a gesture, or, somebody running across the field, as a little tiny person running across the field at the bottom of the frame versus doing a close up and following them on a long lens. So it has a different feeling to it, and there's a different sensibility and different metaphor.
I'm glad you said feeling. This is something that I've been ruminating on for a minute now, which is not a literal minute, but like a few weeks now. It feels it feels like art is becoming much more clinical. I'm starting to use all the words that Fran used in the visual arts. It's becoming more clinical, where there is a quote unquote correct answer, where you don't feel, it's not feeling based anymore. It doesn't elicit a response. It's checking a box. This is what you were supposed to do. Do you feel that that's happening, or am I losing my mind?
No, I do. I do think that it's become, it's almost like our lives are out here, and that people are experiencing our lives out there rather than checking in with their inner voices and actually looking out at the world around them. I mean, that's the whole thing about what Fran said in Pretend It's a City. And the reason why I love this series, because, it has great meaning about what our lives used to be like before we had the devices all around, and that people would actually look out and look in front of them and look around them and look down to see what's going on around them. We don't do that anymore. Everybody is going from A to B, and in the interim time, we're in our phones. And to me, the classic kind of example of that are these apps that are map apps, like Waze and Google Maps and everything. And so most of the time now, and I find the younger generation, they use them automatically, even if they're walking down the street, right? It's like, how do I get to 34th Street? I remember when I was younger and you get out of the subway and it's like, okay, where am I going? Is it uptown or downtown? And then you figure out, it's like either you walk the block and you see what the next street is, or you look at the sun, or you look at, okay, that traffic goes uptown and this is downtown, and you use your brain to figure it out. Now, what's happening is it's like when you use, you put in the address and then it has an arrow, and the furthest you can see is the next block. So
Yeah.
your vision is myopic right here. And everybody is going around like this, and they're believing what this app is telling them. So it's like, that to me is a metaphor for life today with what's happening. Is everybody is going around like this and following what the app is telling them, right? So
Well,
is that how you're going to live your life? You don't look at the map, or you don't look at the bigger view to see how you're going. So you have the broadest perspective. So you're looking far. You're not looking here. If you ride a motorcycle and you look here, you're dead.
right.
Riding a motorcycle, you have to look ahead so you can anticipate what's coming up and see where you're going to, and to know, the route. And now everybody's like this. And to me, that's, Pretend It's a City is such a great look forward in a way. Everybody might think it was like look back in the way life was, but it's not actually that. It's a look forward. Fran is the one who's looking forward. And that's the thing we need to be reminded of.
Yeah, it's one thing that has been said a lot about the millennial generation, and especially of which I am a part, and the upcoming generation, is there is a huge problem with self-esteem or self-worth, or not believing in one. There's no confidence. And there's certainly something to be said for, like, we're constantly inundated with, like, well, the world's on fire, you're never going to own a house, blah blah blah. That can definitely sap your confidence and your
Right.
attractiveness to life. But I think, like what Fran was saying about the wellness movement, we believe in exercise is incredibly important, but we don't. Sounds so corny. We don't exercise our mind. Not using the app and looking up and figuring it out is exercising the mind. And that goes into the way you do anything is the way you do everything. And so I feel like we could make better artists out of people who do pull their head. And Lord knows I'm a giant tech nerd, so I'm just as guilty as anyone. But I've consciously tried to not be. I try not to use the phone almost ever. And also, I have an Android, so no one wants to text me anyway. But I do think that's incredibly important. When I was just interviewing someone, and she was saying how, as a professor, she teaches at NYU. Her name is Maria Rusci. Blanked on her name for a second. And she was saying that the thing that digital cinematography has sort of taught her students have taught her, is that if they don't have to do something, they won't. So they don't necessarily have to learn proper exposure, because they can just push a button and the ISO changes and now it's exposed. So that now contrast starts to go, I'm now editorializing, but like contrast can start to become less important because now it's exposed, it's not lit. Right. all things like this, where again, the thesis of that thought is the way you do anything is the way you do everything.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's kind of like and part of it is training too, if you grow up not making your bed and throwing your clothes on the floor, good luck when you get to college and then afterwards. I thank again and again my mother for drumming into me this training, because I know that I do certain things automatically like that. It leaves my brain free for all the other stuff. You know what I mean? And sure, you could throw everything on the floor, but then I don't know, it's about organizing your brain in a certain way, and just, having certain things organized so you're allowing space for other things. And I think that, when I started in film, you didn't know what the dailies were going to look like. I mean, you were hoping. I mean, even the best DPs, and we'd laugh about it, because they think, remember in the old film days, it's like you're trying something, you don't know what it's going to look like. And you'd be sitting there for dailies after you shoot for the day, you'd see the days before his dailies that night. And the entire crew would be there, or all the keys. And you'd sit there and project dailies for 2 hours. And I'm telling you, as a DP, you're trembling in your seat because you're like, oh my God, did I expose that correctly? Did I screw that up? I mean, there's this element of anticipation and of really trying to get it right. And so, but there are times when things are, not quite right, but they work. And really interesting for me, I learned that very early on because I shot a film called Unzipped, right? And the director Douglas was a photographer, and the subject Isaac Masrati was his boyfriend, and so I was running around with both of them, and we were shooting models and that kind of thing. And so there were moments where he would take a Super 8 camera and he would shoot Isaac, which was fine. I was like, look, the only rules that we have are that no color. It was all black and white, 16 millimeter black and white, until we get to the fashion show, right? But we can have color, but we have to shoot Super 8. No video. I don't want forget about doing video. I think it was like high 8 at the time, and I was like, no video. But I mean, video can have its own beautiful quality. But what ended up happening is that to Douglas took the film to Sundance, right? Didn't tell me, and I didn't time the film, right? So I didn't do the final print, right? And you see your reaction. It's like, what? So I happened to be at Sundance that year, and I see Unzipped, and I'm like, I'm going to go to the film. So I go to the screening, right? I'm like, Douglas, what the fuck? It's like, you should have called me so I can time the film. And he goes, oh, I didn't have time. This is the first answer print. And we can do it after Sundance. I'm like, okay. So yeah, we'll see. So I sit down and I watch the film, and I have to say, sometimes the color gets a little magenta, sometimes it's a little green, but it really gave it something interesting. Because remember, it was mostly black and white, right? But there were moments when it was funky, but the funkiness worked, right? So after the screening, I'm like, wow, I hear I was really worried, and I thought, I just let it, I just accepted it as it was to see what it was like, right? And I thought, I never would have done that if I was timing the film. I would have done certain things, right? So afterwards, he came to me and he says, okay, so, let's talk so that we can, set up a timing session for the second answer print. And I was like, no. I said, don't touch it. I said, it's exactly the way it should be. Don't touch it. And I actually had another situation like that where I learned about how, I learned from a mistake and used that mistake to help me. So my first union movie in New York was a movie with Andy Garcia, right? And we had this hallway shot where Andy Garcia comes in the hallway, New York City apartment building, comes in the hallway, painted like glossy white. Thank you very much. Right. Like a million coats of paint. Comes around the corner. So there's daylight coming in. He comes around the corner and he goes to the door, knocks on the door. There's fluorescent lights in the hallway and opens up the door. Andy McDowell opens up the door. Right. She's the love interest. She opens up the door. They have a conversation and then he goes in. Right. So I have them switch out the warm white fluorescent bulbs to daylight, right? Daylight balance, right? So, or they were supposed to put gels on them. I don't remember. This is way before Kino flows. So like regular fluorescent, right? So I go away, I come back, we're ready to go. They apparently switched out the bulbs. I didn't notice, although I can see very much the difference between warm white, cool white, daylight. I mean, you have a sensitive eye. You can see it. Right. But I wasn't really seeing it. We're all film. I mean, this is early film, right? 35 millimeter all film. So I didn't catch it. We start the scene, we're shooting the scene, and I'm, worried about the move or whatever it is. And I don't notice until I see the dailies the next day with everybody else, right? That the fluorescent light over the doorway where they were standing and talking had not been switched out. So what color is it? Green. right?
Sick.
Now, this is all photochemical. So this is way before you can a DI. I mean, DI wasn't even thought of then. It wasn't even a thought.
Mm.
So the idea that you could change it digitally didn't exist. You had to live with the green, and I had to time it. And you only have certain, you can either, take out the green, which affects the exposure, or deal with the red, or deal with the yellow. So you're dealing with three colors. Hello, So I had to time it in such a way that it was less apparent, right? And I was so upset. I was so upset because it was just, to me, it was like, like, and I'm such a perfectionist, and for that to happen was just killer. So the next movie I did was the Mod Squad, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to now take that green and I'm going to use it everywhere. So that's when I started using uncorrected fluorescent lights everywhere. I was using cool whites, warm whites. I mean, warm whites get really dirty, but the cool whites have a really cool look. Was mixing light everywhere. I was using mixed light. That's how I started using mixed light. People
and the cool
were
whites,
really
cool whites are about like 4,000 Kelvin. Or
yeah, they're more kind of blue. They got a blue. There's like cyan. Warm whites are kind of dirty green, yellow, right? So I like the cooler, crisper look of that, and so I started using them everywhere, right? And mixing light. Up to then, the only person who was really mixing light was Robbie Mueller. He would mix light, right? And I loved his cinematography, so I was well aware of how he would use neon or fluorescence or that kind of thing. So I was like, I'm doing that because now I'm not going to let that beat me. I'm going to use the green creatively and artistically. So that was my story of green.
Well, it's interesting you say that because I'm a big, I wrote this down and my friend said, don't talk about this, but I'm glad you brought it up. I really like green, and everyone says, oh, it's ugly color. You need to time that out. And I'm like, I don't like a green shadow. I don't know why I love it so much, but I do.
But green, a lot of us cinematographers love green. I like cyan green, but look at all of the like commercials. We add so much green into it and green softens the entire image. So that's the whole thing. It's like there's the Kodak way, the Kodak card, right?
Right.
And
That
Fuji
lady.
used to have a lot more cyan in it, right? In the shadow areas, right? Fujifilm, which I loved. So, I love the green. I love the kind of feeling. You're much more green than I am in this podcast right now, right? But I like that. And a lot of cinematographers like the green. Tagging the green out is much more of I think of it as more Sony color or Kodak color in the old days of film emulsions, right? That they were timed, for me, Kodak was always much more in the red and blues, right? Which I like the softer look of the Fuji, which was much more European. I love the old European films, like When Father Went Away on Business. I always looked at that film and I was like, I love the way it looked. There was Agfa film and Fuji film, and I was much more in tune with the European films. So when Eternal Sunshine came around, by then Kodak had begun to change a lot of the film stocks, right? So they were making them more contrasty. The print stock got more contrasty, and I like softer blacks. So when I did Eternal Sunshine, right, I shot on Kodak negative, so original negative Kodak.
Was that like 93?
Yeah, 93 and 98, because we were shooting a lot of night stuff and I was wide open on a 1.3. These nice super speeds.
AC best friend.
I had genius focus pullers, Carlos Guerra and Stanley Fernandez, right? They were the best focus pullers in New York. And, the little hands, they could pull on a 180 at, wide open on a dolly going across the street. And really like stuff where you go like, oh my God.
I
But
do have a note here that you had a great one on this project because Fran's very a lot of
yeah.
that.
Yeah, no, but I was self-focusing my camera. So when it goes
Oh,
out of
great
focus,
job.
that's all me.
Never saw
No,
it. Never happened once.
I thought it going out of focus. I was like, because I would be too intent on listening to what Fran was saying, laughing with Marty, trying not to, I wouldn't put my hands on the camera because I would move the camera because I would be laughing so much.
Mm.
And so I would miss sometimes when she would come forward because I wouldn't have my hands on the barrel. Anyway.
Yeah.
Uh,
So Eternal
so
Sunshine.
yeah, so Eternal Sunshine. So I printed it on Fuji stock, and it was really wonderful stock. It was really rich in the colors, and I loved all the cyan in the shadow areas. I just loved it so much. So so we did some first answer prints. We printed it in dailies, right? Because I needed to do some dailies references because at that point we were looking at some things digitally on we were looking at it on HCSR wasn't invented by then. So I think it was on beta SP. Right. So we looked at dailies on beta SP, but I did have prints made so I could see what it was going to look like on print. And then Peter Jackson was doing all these prints with Andrew, right? Who I know, Andrew Lesney, who was a good friend of mine. I had to call him up. And they were printing Lord of the Rings, and they didn't like the green in the Fuji. So Peter Jackson got them to take the green out of that foam stock.
Oh no.
And I was like, I couldn't believe it. I called up Andrew Lesney. I was like, Andrew, what are you doing? That's my favorite foam stock. So then I called up Beverly Woods, who was a genius over at Deluxe, right? Who was doing all the DIs with everybody.
Legend.
Beverly Woods, she's an amazing, amazing person. Super smart, started out as a chemist at Kodak, and then became the point person for all the top DPs in the world. Oftentimes, it'd be like midnight and I'd see her sitting on a curb in the Deluxe parking lot with Roger Deakins, or then she'd be walking down the hall and she'd be with Chivo, or she was with me, at 1:00 in the morning looking at prints for Eternal Sunshine before the premiere, and I'm like, it's not, we got to lighten it up one point, She was like, okay. So anyway, so I asked her, I said, listen, I need you to get as much of this stock as you can from all over the world before it gets all used up, and put it in a vault so that when I do all the prints for Eternal Sunshine, I can print it on that stock.
Yeah.
Those are the kind of negotiations that go on behind the scenes.
Well, I'm glad you brought up all of that because obviously one thing I noted about Pretend It's a City is the color. Two things. The color. I know you shot Venice, right? Was that on the whole thing or yeah?
Primarily, there are different. There was another piece of the material with Spike and Fran, which we had shot 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
That was before the Venice came out. So
right.
I think I shot that on the Alexa. So so it's a combination. But all of the interviews with Fran and the Players Club, and everything that's walking with her on the street, that was with the Venice, with the Rialta, when we were on the streets.
And I noticed that I wanted to ask if this was in the DI, or if I would assume this was on the lens, but there's a beautiful diffusion, especially in the sit down. And you said it's the Players Club that they're in, that like bar set.
Yeah.
Set, quote unquote.
Yeah. It's a real bar.
Yeah. That was my friend Nick, who's the director I was talking about earlier, was sitting there and, we're watching it and he's going, I love this wide, like there's a wide shot to her right, kind of, shadow side. And you can see someone's at the bar and someone's bartending. And Nick was just like, that's the best shot. Like just enamored with that. But I wanted to know, like, what was that diffusion? What was that look you were going for? And I guess a further follow-up is, which I assume you had a hand with the DI. What look were you going for? Was this kind of like just an instinctual, this is how I want it to look? Or were you attempting to replicate a certain film stock or look, or did Marty have a hand in what went in there? Was he going for something specific?
Well, I knew that, I mean, I wanted to make it a painterly image.
Yes, yes,
So
I
that was
received that.
my intention to go, and I mean, I, you know, a reference would be, Rembrandt, and Velasquez, I mean, really, I've loved them for so many years. And to me, I had done something like that with Bob Dylan, actually, where Bob had asked me if I would come in and relight his appearance on Saturday Night Live, not Saturday Night Live, on the Letterman show. It
Interesting.
was it was the second to last Letterman show ever of the original one, and he was, and he had asked me to come in and relight it, and do it with one camera, and I thought, okay, let me see how that's going to go, because those guys who've been lighting the Letterman show have been doing it for 35 years. So it's
Right.
like kind of coming out and saying, "Hi, do you mind if I relight this? I know this is your second to last day on this show, but so that's what I did." And I turned off, I think, all of the lights except for five, and just made it look like I wanted it to be painterly. So so I was making contrast and putting in warmer lights. And Bob said, he goes, "Oh my God, it looks like a Rembrandt." And I was like, yeah, that's the point, So here I was being a copycat again and wanting Fran to have that that kind of elegance. I wanted it to feel elegant and like it was a painting, and that she's the living painting. She's the living legend, and so is Marty. And it's like, so let's create a cinematic environment that feels, like this is a portrait of an artist, a true artist like Fran, and she is. She's really a visionary person, and she sees the world the way it is, and she says it the way the world is. You know what I mean? She doesn't. She just says the way it is, and I love that about her.
Yeah, I feel like her, like, a lot of people have excused their assholery by saying, I just say how it is. And I would not put Fran in that category. I feel like her sort of frustrations come from a place of love. I personally don't pick on things unless I want them to be better. If I didn't care, it wouldn't even bother me. Like, whatever. Someone somewhere did something stupid. It's like, well, they don't affect me. I don't. But if I'm around it, if I was using the subway every day, I would be, upset about it. But I'm staying there. What was her line? She was saying, can't remember the specific line, but she was saying she stayed in LA or in New York for a reason.
Yeah. Well, she is about people being civil to each other. People, like she says, pretend it's a city. You're
Yeah.
not all by yourself, and that being a really good point about our lives. We don't live in isolation, or go live in a cabin. You can do whatever you want, but it's kind of like, look around you and remember you're a human being, and there are other people around. And
Yeah.
though, even though, I mean, Fran is hilarious. When we did, Marty had asked me to do public speaking many years ago. And, again, I laughed all the way through it. I mean, it was ridiculous. I mean, the camera there, you can see it shake. I was like, are we going to have to stabilize this? And, and Fran would say things, like she likes to smoke. That's Fran's prerogative. Walking along the street and somebody stops her and says, you should be ashamed of yourself. And she's like, excuse me, what are you talking about? They're like, you should be ashamed of yourself. You shouldn't be smoking on the street. And she's like, well, why not? So, you're being a bad role model. And she basically is like, who made me a role model?
Yeah.
So,
In
fact, I'm having dinner with her and the producer tonight. So,
oh,
yeah.
excellent.
Yeah.
That's like another thing we were saying was, like, she would probably be great to have at dinner, and then maybe give her like a few weeks and then come back.
Yeah.
going back to the idea of the look, what was your sort of getting into the nuts and bolts of it? You shot on the Venice. What was your lens filtration and lighting setup specifically for the Players Club? Because I was just enamored with that setup specifically, but even in general.
Well, I used for the lighting. I was using celebs. I love celebs. I love those lights. I'm constantly going on set because the lighting on set has changed so much. And because I'm directing primarily now, I forget what the name of the lights are, or I didn't ever learn them because everything is changing so fast. I'm like, those lights that are, and they're like celebs. I'm like, yes, bring in the celebs because to me, they were the closest to tungsten. They had the softness of tungsten. I always have hated electronic lights because for me, I could feel that it's generated and it always felt sharp. But the celebs always had a roundness. I mean, now the lights are incredible. I mean, when you're looking at, the sky panels that we use the sky panels outside, and we put gels on them. I really wanted warm gels to come in to warm it up as they're coming through. Plus, we used some Parkans, which were the old standbys. And then I used one of those round lights that was in the place. We brought another one in case we were going to see it in shot. That was above the table that would give me a little bit of fill light. So
just like a traditional bulb in a China ball kind of thing?
It was in a glass globe.
Okay.
And those were the lights that were there. So we put that over the table. But I wanted it to be intimate. I wanted to feel like we were with Fran. We had 3 cameras. One was between Marty and Ted Griffith, which was my camera. Then there was another one just over the other side of Marty. And then there was that side shot. And so all of them were on sliders. And, I basically briefed the other operators about what I was looking for and, listen to what she's saying and when do you go wider, when you go tighter. And then I would have monitors so I could see what they were doing. So I could actually say to them or motion to them, go in and that kind of thing. So I still have a modicum of control even while I'm behind the camera. So that's what we did there. And lens wise, I'm pretty sure that we were on the Fujinons. And
great.
Yeah, they're really beautiful lenses and they could work well with and they had the range, the 19 to 90 had the range that I was looking for, just to get in enough. I mean, the 24 to 290s are often really great because now Fujinon, they have a much more wider range of lenses, now even in larger format. But it's like being able to get in if you want. And I knew I didn't want to get too close on Fran. I mean, just thinking that, first of all, it would feel way too TV if I was in too close. But, you have to really think about that and look about who the person is, how close you can get and that kind of thing. And
the difference between intimate and invasive.
Yeah, exactly. And also because, for me too, as I'm getting older, it's like I'm looking at myself on the Zoom going like, okay, I'm just going to sit like this the whole
Zoom
time,
is
right?
nature's diffusion filter.
Terrible, right? So it's like, okay, what am I going to do? We do care what we look like, I mean, unless you're playing a character that, really wants to show that, like Kate in Mayor of Easttown, she really had to fight to have all of the publicity posters and everything not be airbrushed. She wanted, that was Mayor. She wanted to see, a little bit of stomach gut here. You know what I mean? That was important to the character. But for me right now, no. So I was thinking like, I should put some gaffer's tape here, But anyway, it's like thinking about things like that is like, where does the light go? How can I bring it across? Also, Fran has glasses. So it's like, how do I keep the glasses clean so that we don't see lights dancing around on them? And that's tricky. It's a fine balancing act. But I did know that I wanted to bring the strong lights in and I wanted to have contrast and let the guys be more or less silhouette at the bar, but light the bar separately. And And then I used a very light fluorescence on the filter. Yeah, so
Mm.
that gives it that kind of. They're really interesting filters. They give it that kind of a glow to it. So
Yeah, I've main reason why I was kind of singularly focused on the filtration was just because everyone and their mom uses a black pro mist now, and I think I used to be that guy, and now the more I've looked at it, I'm like it's too much. Even like a 1/8, that's still very washy, and so I was looking at like pearlescence, black satins, and glimmer glasses, and I've just kind of been like those have
yeah.
just been bouncing around in my head for like a few weeks now.
Well, for years, people would use when the ProMist came out, they would use ProMist, and I never, ever, ever used ProMist,
Mm,
ever. And the reason why was because they take away the appearance of sharpness.
mm,
And I would always use uh, ultracons because ultracons preserve the appearance of sharpness, but they give a little tiny bit of halation to the highlights, but it preserves the appearance of sharpness. The promise had just it was just fuzzy. It's like
right.
fuzzy, and I never liked that. It wasn't. I've always liked soft directional light. So rather than using a silk, which just makes the light go everywhere, and it doesn't have any sensibility. It's just like a cloud there. I always like using um what's it called? What's the name of the diffusion? Um Grid cloth.
Oh, sure, yeah, yeah.
Like light grid to me was great because it made it soft, but you can still feel the direction of it, you know. And it's the same thing when you're bouncing like Muzz, or if you want to go directionally through Muzz, you can make it feel directional, but you have to put a really big light behind it.
Right. Yeah, that's something that I kind of circling back to the sort of film versus digital thing. Um, I kind of asked this of every DB who has shot a handful of features on film, and that is, how has digital changed the way that you light? Because obviously, a quick answer is like, well, you can just use less. You can use less of them. You don't need to, because the sensitivity is so high. You can potentially light with one or two lights versus having to go back there and put one at every place. But um, for you, how has your approach changed at all, or has it?
Well, my approach for many, many years is always how can I augment the light, because I take a more naturalistic kind of approach to it. I
Mm,
like I like natural light when it's in the right spot. So it was always about how I could augment it. So for me, the digital world in nighttime made a huge difference because
sure.
then you can actually see really deep into your shadow areas and then you can control them. Before you're just trying to get an exposure so that it wouldn't get grainy in the shadows, which was the challenge. Or if you were doing anamorphic, where you're at a 4 or 5.6, because in the old anamorphic lenses, the most wide open it would go to be 4 or 5.6. So if you're at a 4, you'd get a lot of aberration, but at a 5.6, to clean it up a little bit. But you need a lot of light at night. And so for me, I like being able to see more where I can control it. But, so much of the digital for me is about taking light away than adding light. It's like how to create negative fill so that you can create contrast. Because for me, the digital world was always like, the more it looked like video is the more that it was just splat lighting. It just felt like overlit. And also talking about the feeling thing, for me, video, at least early video and digital, was all about, the background would come forward. So you didn't have that, depth of field, the ability to shift the depth of field. And it's sort of like we're experiencing that here as a classic example looking at this podcast where you've obviously have a still camera that you've set up in between, or a movie camera set up in between your computer and and the image. I mean, you're going through an HDMI, right, to from a camera. I'm going
Yeah.
through my computer since this, I didn't have time to prep this, and
This is pre-set up for every interview, so yeah, I didn't I
yeah.
didn't have to rush to get here.
So Right. So here I am, this is my computer camera, which of course we know is wide angle, as I'm sure it's like an 11 or a 16, if not more. So I don't have too much control of that unless I put a filter over it,
Yeah.
which I've thought about doing actually. But I don't
The
think it will change the depth of field, actually. I don't think that these lenses in here are able to do that.
No, I think that, I mean, how small is that sensor? I mean, even an iPhone has like a half-inch sensor now, and I think webcams are like 1/8. Like they're just minuscule.
Yeah. So there
Yeah,
you go.
for anyone listening, it's a C500 full frame sensor with a Nikkor 35 millimeter like photography lens on it, the old AIS, and then I do have a little teleprompter, and the teleprompter gives me a little bit of diffusion, which sometimes I'm noticing now, like if it gets a little too bright back there, it'll just wash gets very flat. But what can you do?
So
Teleprompter is
you
better
guys
than doing this
decide
now.
who looks better.
Yeah. um, Actually, going even further back, I had a note here that I did want to, that was brought to mind, and they're kind of, I guess, tangentially related. One of them was Duke Ellington, and someone was talking, and he was talking about conservatory jazz musicians versus, I guess, just doing the work, figuring it out, feet going with feeling. And I was wondering if you had a sort of I felt the analogy with film now, where it feels like from like obviously the beginning of film up until somewhere around the 90s, it all felt very experimental. And then now it's very much like kind of what I was saying at the beginning of there's a correct answer. Like I feel like film school has not helped foster creativity or film education. It's helped foster sameness. And
Yeah.
that conservatory versus doing the work thing kind of struck me as being analogous in some way.
Well, yes, and I think that's always been true. I mean, when you think about art school, and you think about all the artists who have come down through the ages, in their painting schools and going in the school of whatever, the school, Vermeer and all of those guys, and then the people who depart from that, Picasso and all the people who then start doing something different, exploring it in a different way. And the same thing with musicians, classically trained musicians who then, they don't depart, or other musicians who do. Look at Thelonious Monk. I mean,
Yeah.
he created his own rules and his own thing. And it's hard to do, you can be someone who masters the craft, really well. You could be a master piano player, but if you don't have feeling in it, and you don't have your own interpretation and your own point of view, then it just becomes an exercise of craft, of how fast can you move your fingers, and you know what I mean. So I think every person has to decide, how they want to step out of the rules. And I've never been. I was talking to Darren about this too. It's like we live in New York in a way. We said, well, we never moved to LA because there's a certain kind of spirit in New York, which is, it's not confining to the rules. There's something that's, there's a free spirit in New York that we both feel, and it inspires us. It inspires us to be bold and daring where you don't normally be. Like when I did Personal Velocity, I mean, me going into the digital world, it was like the second time actually, because the first time being bamboozled, which was these amateur cameras where the lenses are shit. I mean, they didn't resolve well at all. Spike likes to do wide angle shots, and they can't resolve. The lenses look totally out of focus because the lenses couldn't resolve. I mean, they're not even digital. I mean, we're talking tape, right? So it's like, how do you maneuver that? How do you manipulate that? The office set was on the north side of an office building in Manhattan that looked out on the sun side. I was dying.
Yeah.
So then when I got to Personal Velocity, for me, I was like, okay, I'm just going to accept this medium. I didn't want to do it. I wanted to shoot film, couldn't do it. That wasn't part of the approach with those cameras. So I just thought, all right, I'm going to decide on my own rules. So instead of shooting it at um, a 60th or a 50th, because we were shooting in PAL, so not a 50th of the shutter
Sure.
speed, I shot it at 125th, right? And the guys, when we did the test to do the film out, which film out was just a beginning at that point, so it was a baby industry. And they were saying, oh, no, but you can't do that, And I said, why not? And they said, well, because you're going to lose half a field. And I said, how much is half a field of
like
data?
interlaced.
Yeah.
Like half of actual field. Okay, got it.
Yeah. I was like, nothing. How much is that going to change that? But the way it feels to me is more filmic at 125th. It feels more like cinema, less like video. I'm doing it at 125th. I don't care. Right. So they're like, all right, we'll see when we get to the film out, So, and then I would trick the sensor. I mean, I didn't even know if the sensor was probably the size of a pinhead at that point, to the white balance. I would trick the white balance and then put film filters on it and just over, and so I was doing all this stuff because I was like, just trying to like get it to do something and be interesting. And then I didn't put the attachments on to do the anamorphic, so you have the full frame. I didn't shoot it full frame because I was like, I already have to think about, I'm not going to be thinking about the, cutting off the frame. Besides, if somebody gets a hold of it, I don't want them to think that they can use the full frame for the 133 version that you had to do in those days, right? And then I was like, I'm not going to look at the focus on this viewfinder, the flip out viewfinder. I said, I have to have a monitor next to me at all times. And I operated the whole film like this, looking at the monitor, because I have to self-focus.
Right.
There's no markings on there. You can't have a. So I did all of that because I was like, all right, I got to find some way that I could deal with this camera. And so then, when the film came out, it won the best cinematography at Sundance. It was the first digital film.
There you go.
And everybody was like, oh my God, looks so beautiful. How did you do that? And I basically said, because I didn't listen to anybody. So you have to follow your intuition, and that goes back to what we said about the feeling. It has to be about the feeling.
Yeah, that was, yeah, and I think too, like another line that Fran had said is like what was it? Grand Central Station's beautiful because one person built it, and it wasn't, like the rest of that sentence. If I were to elaborate using my own words, is like it wasn't built by committee. Yeah. And I think vision. It's that vision that I think is incredibly important.
And you have to make decisions. I mean, that's the thing about being a director or being the DP. You have to make decisions about what it is. And that's part of that, of decision making. It's, I want this, I don't want that. I don't know what I want, but I know, it's like all of those kind of decisions that get made.
Yeah.
And Grand Central was great until they put up all those advertisements for so many years.
Oh, it was, hey, by the way, very cool that they let you, I was, that light switch can't be the actual light switch.
I'll let you figure it out.
Oh, you bloody woman. But it was a great shot. I love that.
See, Fran's magical. See?
Yeah.
You never know. I mean, now I think everybody's got to walk around New York City, right? Go to all the spots that we went to, and check it out. See
if you can find them. I just had an interview with David Attenborough's DP, Gavin Thurston, and you and him seem to have a similar, you need to break the rules. You have to do your own thing. And so one question I had for him that I'm going to pose to you is, working with someone like David Attenborough or working with someone like Martin Scorsese is something that I think many people would envy or whatever. But something I've always kind of wondered is, what is something that Marty has taught you that you've carried through into your either personal life or work, something that he's potentially modeled that you're like, I'm doing that?
Marty has from the past, and I've known Marty since I kind of came into the family. I was invited by Emma Tillinger to work on something with Marty years ago. And I know Emma Tillinger Koskoff. I know her from the movie Blow when I was a DP on the movie Blow. I always say we did Blow together, but and people look at me like, what? You know, um, but the thing about Marty is that, Marty is interested in telling stories that have meaning. And working with him, I know that it's important too, that, the reason why you do certain things, the reason why you take certain shots is because they mean something, so it's just not arbitrary, that it's about telling the story that collectively has a certain message or a story or a certain experience. And so I see him again and again. He also goes and listens to that inner voice about what's important. And a sound person was telling me that I worked with a couple about last month. He says, "Oh yeah, I worked for Marty many years ago, and I had to do this pickup shot with him, and it was for sound, right? So they had to do this sound recording. And he said I was scared shitless, Martin Scorsese, and I go in there and I tried to set up what we were doing as much as possible, and to get the cleanest sound. And Marty was like, I don't want the cleanest sound. I want it to feel like this. And they, I don't know what it was, that they were scratching the dirt or whatever they were doing. It was like, it was completely not what you would expect from a perfect sound recording. But he was doing it for a reason, because that's the way it sounded. There was a realness to it, and he wanted to get to the realness of it. So now, he's doing Killers of the Flower Moon, which he's filming right now in Oklahoma, and which was based on a story that happened in the 1920s. And he has a hand crank camera, Bell and Howell, that was given to him as a gift. And we used part of that Bell and Howell on some of Pretend It's a City for some of the background. And now he wants to use it again because the cameras at the time were hand crank cameras. So he wants to incorporate that in part of the story. So, he's someone he's like an encyclopedia. He knows more knowledge about films and can cite them off the top of his head than anybody I know. He's always thinking about, cinema and references and that kind of thing. And it's such a pleasure to be around him and to talk with him and to see how he's reacting to certain things, what his reactions are. And so much is about, shaping it for that meaning.
Is there that brings up, this is a silly question, and I know we're coming up on time and I don't want to hold you all day, although I could talk to you for fucking hours. I'm loving this. Is there a movie that Scorsese doesn't like? It seems like any movie you name, he's just like, let me tell you about all the fantastic things about this film.
Did he talk about the Marvels TV shows? No. No. I don't know. You'd have to ask Marty himself.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, yeah.
I just watched the Criterion of the Red Shoes, and of course he's got like a whole featurette on it about it, and I just watched that and I was like, this is I just watching that little bit made me want to be a little bit more like that in the sense of not necessarily encyclopedic knowledge, but just that love of cinema and the like really digging into it. Because I came from I loved growing up. I had the same like one theater type thing in my hometown, but it was always like the sci-fi movies and the kind of more fun blockbustery type things that I was always into. And that while it was still true cinema for me, the experience was true cinema. I never got into filmmaking, so to speak. And then even throughout college, it wasn't, there was my joke earlier was if it was on Criterion, I didn't see it. I didn't see the real, like I left film school not having seen Citizen Kane, and a while there wore that as like a badge of pride. I was like, they didn't even make me do it, but they did make us watch Do the Right Thing about 100 times.
That's so funny. Well, I mean, Criterion is amazing, and thank God for them. They actually preserved a lot of film. They have an archive of Spike's work now, and
Yeah.
We went through a lot of trouble to go back to the original materials for Bamboozled because we had to do one of the first film out ever in the world was Bamboozled.
Mm.
So, but that was so we could project it because it was all digital. So I said to them, let's go back to the original elements and retransfer it. So they did that, and they spent the time and the energy and the money to do it because they believe in that. And the same thing with Marty, he believes in that. He's very active. He has a film foundation, which is all about preservation. And my mom is a huge movie buff. She watches movies all the time. She can tell you who the third grip is on movies. And she loves Westerns, and she's 90 now, still very sharp. She watches one Western after the other. That's when I catch up on the Western. And
Sure.
she used to be a huge fan of TCM. And Marty used to take the time to write little synopsis for TCM. And they had a booklet. And she said to me, she goes, tell Marty, I'm really upset that they stopped that booklet. I always enjoyed it. My mother, right?
Right.
And I was like, Marty, you have a fan of my mother. She's 90. So
that's always worse when your mom, like, not that I've experienced anything truly like that, but there has been, you move to LA and your mom's like, have you met this person? Because I would like to have a word with them. And you're like, no, I don't. They don't just walk around my house. No, I have not.
Well, my mother has a whole relationship with Spike.
Oh, good.
Because my parents lived in San Antonio for 30 years, and she was a huge Spurs fan. So I would always have this thing going on between the Spurs, and my mom knew all the Knicks. And, she's very funny. She's like, tell Spike, when are you talking to Spike? Tell him. And then she would say, tell Spike not to have so much bad language in his films.
That's fantastic.
Anyway, that's my mother.
I will definitely have to part 2 a conversation at some point next time you're free, because I'm loving this. But I will let you go here. But I do end every podcast with a question, and that is, what sort of one, either whether it be object or a life change or a resource, can you point to that maybe not most appreciably changed your career as a cinematographer, as a filmmaker, but one that just really comes to mind first?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Oh my God. So many things. There's so many things that are little changes. Well, when I was doing my first film, my first documentary, I landed in Cambodia. We were the first film crew in Cambodia after Pol Pot. And I had convinced a good friend of mine to do her thesis film in Cambodia because I knew she could get in. And so it ended up coming around that I ended up going as a cinematographer because I recommended a guy that I was working under for a while. He ended up not being able to go. And so I convinced her to go, even though I had to find a camera and all of this stuff. And so the first day we land, the second day we get taken to the killing fields, the real killing fields.
Jesus.
And the Vietnamese had put up a makeshift shrine that was just a bamboo structure that had all of the skulls. And, a lot of the skulls had still the bands around them with the bullet holes in them. And, it was very fresh. The killing fields was still, there were bones and pieces of clothing all around us and everything. And so, I was a novice, I got out and I just, I set up the camera shaking and I take out my light meter and I'm thinking like, oh my God, I don't know if I really know how to read this thing. And I was like, please God, just don't let me fuck this up.
So prayer.
Yeah, so prayer. Well, that's what's a good thing about digital now. It's like, now you just see what you get, you don't have to pray to God anymore, right?
Yeah, that was actually earlier when you were saying like how nerve-wracking dailies were. That's what I've heard most cinematographers say is like, well, now I get to sleep at night. That's fun.
Yeah, exactly. So there you go. So that's sort of like, I was like, I better learn how to read this thing.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. Like I said, I hope I can have you back on at some point just to continue, because these are the type of conversations that I started this podcast for. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, take care. All right, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Frame and Reference is an Owlbot production. It's produced and edited by me, Kenny McMillan, and distributed by Pro Video Coalition. Our theme song is written and performed by Mark Pelly, and the F&R Mattbox logo was designed by Nate Truax of Truax Branding Company. You can read or watch the podcast you've just heard by going to provideocoalition.com or youtube.com/owlbot, respectively. And as always, thanks for listening.